Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser. I'm the Baptist campus minister here at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Bible Study. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of God to change the world, and we are looking at the good news. The gospel is good news for every person and every part of life. And we've been looking at not only the gospel and good news, but how the gospel directly relates to 5 question areas: relationships, lifestyle, purpose, belonging, and beliefs. Now, last week, kind of in a wrap up sort of video, we talked about how these 5 question areas and the gospel relates to the issues of race and racism around the US. Each week we're going to try to pinpoint one of the contemporary issues and how the gospel relates to that. We're talking about relationships, but we're going to look at each of these areas and deal with how the gospel relates to what we're experiencing with the COVID virus, with the quarantines wrapped around that. So how is the COVID virus creating questions in our lives in these 5 areas? And how are those questions possibly connected to what we know about the gospel? So let's look at COVID from a relational standpoint. How we treat others, how we relate to others, has been deeply affected by this virus. Many of us, especially here on the East Coast, or especially around Drexel, have experienced a loss of interaction, a loss of face-to-face interaction, a loss of personal interactions because of quarantine, because of just changing in our daily routines. So we're feeling less, but we're also noticing which relationships were important to us, which ones we can maintain over the internet, which ones we have to actually go out and engage personally. If you could only visit a few people, who would they be? What relationships really matter to you? And this is different for each person. Also, how we interact in public says a lot about how we relate to others. I might not need to wear a mask for my own personal safety, but do I do that for the health of others? Is me wearing a mask a way I show love to others? Do I put away my personal comfort for the health and safety of others? The gospel tells me that Jesus sacrificed himself for even his enemies. There are a ton of ways we can sacrifice ourselves for the sake of others during COVID. Say I have a relative or a friend who is more at risk than I am, but they need groceries. Do I go out and get groceries for them, which puts me at risk, but it keeps them from being at risk? Is that something I'm willing to do for the sake of others? Am I willing to sacrifice something about my life for others? There are a lot of hurting people. And if I want to love them, how do I love them sacrificially during this time? We look at lifestyle. Our lives have changed drastically. What is the good life is completely redefined. What do we enjoy? What is sufficient? How much interaction do we need? Lifestyle has been drastically affected by COVID. And we see that the gospel, that there is a way things ought to be. And COVID has shifted that. There is shalom. Things are at peace. COVID is definitely not a peace bringing sort of thing. So when things are not at peace, when things are not in shalom, when things are not the way they ought to be, we feel that. And that is the effect of sin in our world. COVID is the effect of sin in our world. And sin has multiple definitions and things like that, but sin interrupting our relationships, COVID could affect our relationship with God. Just this idea of our lifestyle has changed because the world is not at peace. Ultimately, we look at purpose. What is the purpose of my life? I have seen faculty members whose purpose have revolved around research. They have these huge research questions being processed in laboratories and other ways. And yet COVID shutting things down a little bit has asked them to reevaluate what is the purpose of a life? How do we define our purpose? A lot of people whose purpose was revolving around work, they lived to work. Well, what happens when quarantine comes and you can't work? A lot of people lived to make money or lived to party. That was the purpose of their lives. COVID has made us evaluate purpose. Then there are those whose purpose is to serve others. And we see great examples of this, nurses and doctors who throughout the COVID process have sacrificially loved others by serving them, and that was their purpose. And they were willing to do that because their purpose was defined by serving others. Belonging. I don't know about you, but there's a lot of places where I used to feel safe. I used to feel at home. I used to feel like I belonged there. And I no longer feel like I belong there. I rode the train. I rode SEPTA for 45 minutes every day in and out of work. That was a place where I would read, where I would think, where I would organize my day, either going into work or coming back from work. That was kind of a safe haven for me. I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever feel at home on SEPTA again. I'll just look around and see strangers with germs. Um, I may go on SEPTA in the future and I may be wearing a mask and goggles long after the quarantine is gone. I don't know. Some things have changed about where I belong and where I feel safe and where I feel at home. However, this is interesting to look at. It has made me realize that in this world, I am just a wanderer. I'm a little homeless. My true home is not here and now. My true home is in the future. And it allows me to see that I am unsettled here and I'm not as comfortable as I used to be, which might be a good thing. Beliefs. And I've talked a lot about how this belief question has changed um, from what is true to who do I trust. And we see this idea, there has been so many questions about who to trust with the information coming out about COVID. Do we trust Dr. Fauci? I do. I trusted him because I kind of connected with him in HIV/AIDS research long before COVID ever hit. Dr. Fauci was a trusted entity in the field of HIV/AIDS research before he was on stage telling us about COVID. So I trusted him because I had a previous relationship with him beforehand. But when misinformation comes out, when people say strange and unusual things, when doctors have conflicting answers, when Facebook has so much misinformation, when science is not always right on the answer the first time, but we're doing the process, and having been a researcher, I understand that the process is complex and complicated, and we put out the answers as quickly as we can, and sometimes they're wrong because we're still figuring things out. That made perfect sense to me. But who do you trust? Figuring out who you trust is probably going to be the most important question of our lives moving forward. Who do you trust? So as we can see, COVID brought up all these sorts of questions into our lives. And the gospel has answers for them. The gospel has answers for how we should relate to one another in this season. Love. The gospel has answers for how we should live our lives and what is the good life. Peace. Gospel has purpose of serving others in there. The gospel tells me where I truly belong, and that's with God. And the gospel tells me who to trust, and that's Christ. These questions that COVID has brought up have answers, in the gospel. Now, always we can continue these conversations via Zoom in person, live, Monday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or these weekly wrap-ups as I'll be moving through them. And you can find me on social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, and YouTube. All those links will be in the description below. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I hope to talk to you again soon.